Hey everybody. In this video, I'd like to go through two cool features that Figma has recently released. One, variants, and two, the new auto layout panel. For the variants, I want to show you how it can be used in a real-world application, not just in Figma, but also inside of React. So we'll jump into VS Code and see how the similarities of design and similarities of development are coming together in this latest iteration. For auto layout, we'll go through the new panel and talk about some of the ways we can use that. So, variants. You can see in this design, we have this disabled, really light button here with a trash can. We have the colored version and active version with another icon, three similar icons at the bottom, but still a little bit different. And then still, again, another variation on those icons. This one has a stroke, these have a little drop shadow with a white background, and this one is completely grayed out. Now, variation is the key word here because these are actually all part of a variance group or variance frame. Variants let you take different components and group them together into one. So when we go into our assets panel, we don't see 10 or 15 different icon buttons. We see one. We have one icon variant. It's one component here. So that's great. We simplify our assets panel. But what's even better is that we now have this ability to change quickly between different styles and versions of our component in this very similar to key value pairs on the right here. So these are all custom. I can change this name to be whatever I want, but I have an icon property here, and I have a style property here. Let's see what that does. So if I bring this over into our design, let's say I wanted to have a disabled icon, a version of this grid here. So I just go into here and pick on my grid icon and pick out the grayed version or the disabled version. Actually, let's go with the stroked version. So now there's no drop shadow and a stroke around it. And you know what? Let's go to let's go to link out. And just like that, in a few short clicks, we have multiple versions of this one button using different icons and styles. Now, all of that is contained inside of our variant here. This is a new sort of frame, component frame that Figma gives us. There's a great video that I'll include as a link that goes through how do we actually build out a variant, because there's so much you can do, and that can be a whole nother video on itself, so I'll include that. But as you can see that this can actually expand it out quite a bit. There's a lot of different functionality in terms of what we can have as properties. And it's a great thing to add to your next project to save time. So that's variants. Just a quick introduction letting you know that it's there. And like I said, I'll include a link to show you how to actually build those in a separate video. Now, well, actually, before we go to auto layout, I want to show you how do variants work with React and with VS Code and sort of that symbiotic relationship, if you would. So looking back at our design, we have this slider here, and we have these icons in it, and buttons. If we jump into VS Code, we have several panels here. The first one to look at is this middle one, the tool icon component. So this tool icon takes in props, and it takes in a prop for a click handler. So on click, it'll do something. It takes in a prop for a class name. Now think of our style for this, whether it's gray, colored, box shadow with a white background, or a stroke around the background. And it also has a circle and path props, which allows us to dictate the shape of that component and how does the icon look. With this one single component, we can use it in different places. So we're using this tool icon component in 3 places inside of our app, passing in different classes and passing in different icons, so it changes. And all of that is controlled in one CSS file. So we have our disabled, a primary, and a warning, and a stroke. And this lets us use it in also different files. So if I jump out to the header, you can see that the header is using the same tool icon in two different places and doing all sorts of dynamic coding to show different class styles and show different icons based on other things happening in the component and within the app. So there's this almost similarity that's happening between Figma, allowing you to have different variations being stored essentially as almost props. And then now pulling that into VS Code, it just kind of brings that process closer together, and that's really awesome. Okay, so now on to auto layout. So auto layout, if you don't already know, is a really great way of sizing up and almost having your designs be a little bit more responsive, and Figma doing a lot of calculations for you, so you don't have to be clicking and dragging things around when things change. So what does that mean? So like, for example, let's say you have a button. And around this button, let's create a background, and we'll make this blue, throw it back there. Maybe we have this be a white color here. Okay, kind of change that around. That looks good. And then button is not really a great name. We want to call this learn more. Well, unfortunately, now we have to go in, resize this, make sure it's the same. It's really not. Okay, and then we're many steps into this process. Well, auto layouts allow us to make this a lot easier. So I'm going to hold Shift and select A, and now an auto layout has been applied to this button. We can see it says frame here, which helps us understand that as well. And we now have an auto layouts panel. And if I type learn more, our button adheres to the padding and resizes for us, which is great. I want to show you one more real world example before we jump into the panel. So we have this form here, which gets used throughout the app. And let's say, in one place we want it to be the simplified version, but in another place we want it to be have a category. Well, I can just turn that category grouping back on, and it automatically lets us keep that same padding in between everything, making this very quick to update forms and all sorts of elements. So to really understand auto layout and to better understand the new panel, let's create a navbar together real quick. So I'm going to have link 1 here, and let's do link 2, and I'm going to select both of them and hit Shift A, and now we have an auto layout frame. And let's add a couple more links here. So now these are actually 31 pixels. We'll change that in a second, but I'm going to hit Command D twice to create two duplicates, all having the same spacing in between. Cool. Now if we click on it and come to the right, we have our auto layout panel. We can change the orientation or direction. So imagine a desktop layout versus mobile layout very quickly, which is easy. We have our space between lines. So this is the padding in between each of these elements. And I can simply click and drag, or I can add in, let's say 16 pixels. Maybe we want 20 for this size font. That looks pretty good. Okay, now I'm going to add in, not that many, I'm going to add in a background color here. And I'm going to rename this navbar. Hit Command R to bring up the layer naming inside of the group layers panel. So navbar. And now we can add padding around the entire group of elements inside of our auto layout frame. So let's add 10 pixels of padding. Cool. Now this font is a little bit more space on top than it does on bottom, and I feel a little bit claustrophobic seeing these sides come in so close as they are. So we can go to this button here, alignment and padding, that's now in auto layout, and we can custom change the padding on each side. So maybe the top is 8 pixels. That feels a little bit more even. And maybe we give 20 pixels to left and right. There we go. That feels a little better. Now, as you can see here, there's this sort of grid section in the middle, Looks a little bit like marketing charts. And then we have packed and space between the bottom. And this essentially is more Flexbox properties coming into play, which is awesome. So if I actually make the width wider, I can then come in and have this be centered left or right. And notice how the links are staying together, preserving that 20 pixels of padding in between each one. That's because I have it packed. But if I want to have a space between, now it's going to fill up that space in between. And if I make this tall, all of a sudden we can now vertically center these. And if we have them packed, we can center them to corners or align them to corners. So there's a lot of flexibility here, which is awesome. So we're going to reverse it all the way back here and come down to constraints and resizing. So this deals a little bit with how this frame, this group of elements, work within itself, but then also how does it work with others? So what I mean by that is we can resize the items to hug the content. So this navbar now is going to preserve the spacing that we had set up in the auto layout, versus if we have fixed content, that allows us to move the width top and bottom however we like, and right and left however we like, and have it hug content here. Now, we also have constraints. Constraints lets us pin things to different corners of a parent element. So, for example, I'm going to create a new frame here that this will live in, and this frame, let's give it a fill here of maybe this gradient. Cool. And we can center it here. Now, the way this currently is set up, the constraints are to the top and left, which means that if I resize this, notice how it pins to the top and left-hand side. But alternatively, I can have this be the center, top and bottom, left and right, and now it stays pinned to the center, which is awesome. And then we can also have it be scaling top and bottom. And because it is an auto layout where I have it hugging the content, we don't see that change. But if I click and make it fixed, and let's see here, have this top and bottom. Now we can change the height here as well. So there's a whole recipe of different presets you can have, which is super powerful. And they're all located in this constraints section, but if it's an auto layout, the constraints and resizing, and the auto layout section.